Order. Welcome to meeting number 84 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 17, 2023, and the adopted motion of Wednesday, December 13, 2023, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-49, an act to amend the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. Since today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece. Select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing and health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Additionally, screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. With us today for the first hour, Honourable Steven Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Also, we have witnesses from the Department of Natural Resources, Abigail Lichsfeld, Senior Director, Renewable and Electrical Energy Division, Energy Systems Sector, Annette Tobin, Director, Offshore Management Division, Fuel Sector, from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, Terence Hubbard, President, and Patricia Brady, Vice President, Strategic Policy and Programs, from Parks Canada Agency, Ron Hallman, President and Chief Executive Officer. Minister Guilbeault, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors,
thank you very much. I am very pleased to join the committee today to discuss Bill C-49. You've already named all the people who accompany me, so I won't repeat those names. Before I begin, I would like to point out that we are on the traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, who has been the keepers of the land for tax memorial.
Between the federal and provincial governments of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador in benefit of communities in both provinces and of Canada's national interest. Les amendements dont le comité sont...
The amendments that the committee is studying today will guarantee that many advantages will continue for generations to come.
Agency. Investment in clean energy has risen by 40% since 2020. More than 500 gigawatts of renewable generation capacity are set to be added globally in 2023, which is a new record. Renewables are set to contribute 80% of new power capacity by 2030. Tripling renewable energy capacity, doubling the pace of energy efficiency improvements, ramping up electrification, and slashing methane emissions from the fossil fuel operations together will provide more than 80% of the emission reduction needed by 2030 to put the energy sector on a pathway to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is one of the goals of the Paris Agreement. Offshore wind alone will be a $1 trillion industry by 2040. Effectively managing the offshore petroleum activities has been key to protecting the environment while also capitalizing on an important resource. The Canada Energy Regulator estimates that wind power has the potential to provide about 30% of total electricity supply in 2050 compared to less than 6% in 2021. And according to a recent study by the Public Policy Forum, offshore wind could be for Atlantic Canada what oil was to Texas or hydropower for Quebec. It could supply the region 6.5 million average homes, almost twice the electricity currently consumed in Atlantic Canada annually. Bill C-69 represents an important shift towards accomplishing net zero goals by unlocking our full power potential and building renewable energy projects in Canada's offshore. Mon expérience de l'automne dernier à la COP 20.
My experience at COP28 was promising. Environment is a federal and provincial shared jurisdiction.
Spirit of cooperation with governments of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, aligning jurisdictional processes, leveraging the decades of experience in petroleum management, and strengthening our long-standing commitment to the joint management of the offshore, which includes a balance between ocean activities, including energy production, and the protection of our ocean's environment. Le projet de loi C-49 est
Bill C-49 is important to clarify the role of the bodies, the regulation bodies, by specifying the ability to consult between agencies and federal departments and provincial departments during key steps of the process. This will allow that the position of both management parties are reflected in the process to maximize collaboration.
The Supreme Court came out with an opinion on the Impact Assessment Act. It is important to recognize the Supreme Court explicitly upheld the right of the Government of Canada to implement impact assessment legislation and collaborate with provinces and territories on environmental protection. Respecting these roles in partnership with both provincial government is a priority for the Government of Canada. These amendments to the Accord Acts represent a necessary and ambitious advancement of the principle of joint management in service to our shared economic and environmental goals. Ce projet de loi soutient également l'engagement.
This bill also supports the commitment of Canada taken in 2022 to protect almost, or at least 30% of our oceans by 2030. So these amendments will reinforce the principle of joint management and offer a regulatory pathway to the many uses of our oceans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Guilbeault, for your opening statement. Colleagues, I use these cards. 30-second warning. Red means time's up. I will try not to cut you off, but if I have to, I will, to make sure we can keep the meeting on time. We'll now start with Mr. Small from the Conservative Party of Canada for 6 minutes. Mr. Small, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses and Minister for coming today. Offshore wind energy production in Europe has grown from 11,000 megawatts in 2013 to about, we're closing in on 40,000. That's in Europe, in the North Atlantic nations, as Canada is also a North Atlantic nation. You have the UK, Denmark, Ireland, Finland, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, and Spain, all producing wind energy, and Canada's not. You've had 8 years. You've had 8 years to table this legislation. 8 years of lost opportunity for the people of Atlantic Canada. Is it because you want to do it right, or is it because you care about Atlantic Canada? Or you don't care?
Thank you for the question. I'm frankly a bit puzzled by it since your party opposes the bill that would allow us to build thousands of megawatts of offshore wind for the benefits, for the economic benefits, the environmental benefits, the energy benefits of Atlantic Canadians and by default the rest of Canada.
But with all due respect, Minister, you've had 8 years to come up with this framework. You've had 8 years. So I'm assuming you want to do it right. Is it because you want to do it right? Is that why it took you 8 years? Is that what it is?
There are many reasons why we want to make sure that since we haven't developed offshore wind in Canada, although there's been a lot of on-land development, and it has increased substantially since we took office through a number of federal support for the development of renewable energy across this country. But obviously, offshore is a
So you took 8 years to come up with this framework, and you're criticizing the Conservative Party because we want a couple of weeks, a month, 2 months to analyze this and to make sure that all of those that compete for that same space in the ocean have a seat at the table.
Through the elaboration of this bill, there's been consultations with Indigenous nations. As you know, and I'm sure others have done so, I could quote you the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Premier of Nova Scotia, who are supportive, very supportive of this bill. We've been in discussion with fishermen to ensure that this is done right. We've already started regional impact assessment in both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to ensure that when we develop this, we do it in the right way.
We have a point of order from Mr. Aldag. Mr. Aldag, go ahead.
Just want to go through, we seem to run into this every time where members ask questions, the minister or witnesses attempt to answer, and then they're not given the time and the courtesy to actually respond to the question being asked. We seem to be repeating that pattern again today. So I just ask that perhaps you remind all members that there's time for asking questions and time for answering them.
So, colleagues,
You know what? If you ask a good question,
thank
you
you.
get a good answer.
I'll thank you for your point of order, Mr. Aldag. Colleagues, I would just ask you to ask your question, but allow the minister to provide his answer. I do ask colleagues to give an appropriate amount of time for the minister to answer the question. And so I don't have to interrupt anybody, but also we don't have point of orders to delay our proceedings. So now we'll go back to, I believe you're finishing your answer. I just finished your answer, Minister Guilbeault, or and keep proceeding with the questioning.
When we came into power in 2015, there was no system in place to support the development of renewable energy. So we had to build this from the ground up. There was nothing. There was very few projects being done in a few provinces. Now we're seeing this booming all across the country, and now we're moving to the next step, which is the development of offshore wind development.
Minister, sorry, but I'd like to remind you that your previous two colleagues, Ministers O'Regan and Minister Wilkinson, came to this committee and told us that you extensively consulted with the fishing industry. Now, I've got information, and you probably have it by now as well, that One
Point
Ocean
of order, Mr. Speaker.
received.
That was not the exact words that was used.
Hold on, Mr. Small, ask you to hold. We have a point of order from Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, colleagues, I just want to remind everybody as well. So, can I ask you to hold for a second, Mr. Small, until I complete my ruling?
Carry on.
Ms. Jones, thank you for your point of order. Colleagues, I'll just remind colleagues not to turn on your mics. And if you do have a point of order, state your procedural relevance of your point of order and not use point of orders for or to engage in debate. Thank you. And Mr. Small, back to you.
How much time do I have left, Chair?
You have a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, perfect. So, Ministers O'Regan and Minister Wilkinson told us that there was some consultation. I won't say heavy, I guess. I'll have to take that back because I didn't say, and I quote. So, the FFAW on One Ocean received a presentation of 8 slides for less than a half hour on October the 13th, I think it was. So they didn't have any opportunity to provide feedback, or they weren't even requested to provide any comments in writing. Do you call that consultation?
So as you pointed out, it was not my department, Environment and Climate Change Canada, that was responsible for that part. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has done consultations on the regional impact assessment for offshore wind development. Those consultations ran over a 2-year period, roughly, Terence?
And continue.
And continue. So we have been engaging with many stakeholders, including the fisheries industry, on the development of offshore
that in the
wind.
creating of this bill, that the fishing industry was consulted and well consulted. But we're finding out that that's not the case. Unifor FFAW has told us basically they weren't talked to at all prior to the tabling of this legislation, versus what your colleagues told this committee. Why is your government misleading the public and this committee by talking about how good the consultations were?
So as you rightly point out, it wasn't me that made those statement. It was my colleagues, the Minister of Natural Resources and Minister O'Regan. I would be happy to take your comments back to them and to ensure that a response is provided to the committee.
So if we don't get the framework that the fishing industry wants in this bill, what kind of message is that going to send out to the investors in the wind energy world?
I have spoken with many potential investors who are interested in investing offshore wind, either off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador
I'm sure,
and Nova
I'm
Scotia.
sure you're aware of the
and
conflicts
they're,
that exist
very
worldwide.
interested.
Thank you, Minister, for your answer, and Mr. Small for your time on questioning. The time is up. We will now proceed to Ms. Jones for 6 minutes. Ms. Jones from Liberal Party of Canada. Floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, Minister, for appearing before committee today and for the great work you do in energy transition in Canada. First of all, the amendments to the Atlantic Accord that we're dealing with today impacts only 2 provinces, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. The amendments are before the committee today because these provinces asked for it. Any other provinces or territories that are looking for offshore wind development would take a completely different process. That's my understanding, Minister. So the bill that we're dealing with it today, not 8 years ago, because this is when the provinces in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador seen an opportunity to develop offshore wind and want to change the regulatory process to include it in their provinces under their bodies of regulatory regime. That's my understanding. Can you confirm that that's the case, and that if that was not the case, we probably wouldn't be sitting here with this bill today?
Thank you for the question, MP Jones. It is a fact in Canada that energy development is a provincial and territorial constitutional power. It's not the federal government that decides what gets built, where, and by who. And you're absolutely right. It is those 2 provinces that have come to the federal government to say that they wanted to work with us on the development of the offshore wind resource.
My next question is, we've heard a lot about the fishing industry and the impact on the fishing industry, and it's a huge concern for us. It's a huge concern for me. I'm a former fisheries minister. I grow up in a fishing region. And, you know, I also know that there's a lot of good industry that can coexist in the ocean. And we've seen that with oil and gas in offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, and the consultation and the networking and the working together with the fisheries union and fisheries enterprises themselves. So I ask you, Minister, is there anything in this bill that you think compromises the fishing industry? My understanding from reading the legislation is that if Newfoundland and Labrador or Nova Scotia was to develop an offshore wind project, they would be subject to all the environmental regulations that exist in the country today. They would be subject to all the regulatory processes under the Fisheries Act, as well as the environmental assessment process, and that they would not be able to develop these projects without full consultation of the fishing sector. Can you confirm if that's the process that has to occur for consultation before we ever get to a offshore wind project?
In essence, thank you for the question. In essence, what we're trying to do for offshore wind is what we're doing already on land, where we already have to tackle these issues of different users wanting to use the land for different activities. You could think of forestry, mining, energy development, conservation, and we weigh those, and we do consultations when we evaluate energy projects on land, and we've done that for a great many years, and so it's no different. We will basically be transposing this system to offshore, but you're absolutely right that the laws and regulations that we have for the development of energy projects will apply offshore as they apply onshore.
Minister, you're a staunch environmentalist. I've gotten to learn that from you. And I know that when you look at development of any sort, you look very heavily at what the impact is on the land, on the ocean, on all creatures and species that occupy the planet in which this is happening. Can you outline for me if their department has looked at any particular data that we could help fishers feel a bit more comfortable? We know offshore wind is happening in other places. I know that fishers have expressed concerns over what it means in the marine ecosystem. Just wondering if you or your department has any data or information that you might be able to share with us around that.
Thank you for the question. You're right. I have been interested in environmental issues for a very long time. The first time the organization I work with published a report on offshore wind was in 1997 in front of the Quebec Energy Board. So I've been paying very close attention to the development of this file, both in Canada and around the world. I was talking earlier about the regional impact assessment that the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has undertaken, and it is examining these specific questions thoroughly, looking at potential impacts and mitigation measures and gathering data on offshore wind projects around the world. And this will be, the findings of IAC will be presented publicly. It is unfortunate that the Conservative Party voted against funding to conduct marine data collection to further our understanding of wildlife and environmental consideration. That being said, you rightly pointed out that there are a number of countries in the world where we see, and MP Small was talking about, the blooming offshore wind energy in Europe, for example, the United Kingdom and other North Sea countries where we've seen lots of offshore wind development and where we're still seeing a thriving fishery industry.
I only have 5 seconds, so maybe I'll take the time to, that's it?
It's about 5 seconds. Yes, thank you, Ms. Jones. And we'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 6 minutes.
Yvonne gave me her time because we like each other a lot. All right, I'm happy that you're here, Mr. Guilbeault. I want to ask you a question that is similar to what I asked your colleagues. I don't believe that C-49 is a bill that's aimed at transition. The transition is about going from high carbon energy to low carbon energy. And what I see in C-49, and I will paraphrase Normand Gousseau, and I think you're familiar with who he is. In C-49, we're putting on the same footing renewable energies and fossil energy. There's nothing to indicate in C-49 that we're looking to reduce fossil energy. What we're looking to do is to develop wind farms, and that's good, with all the potential obstacles that involves. There's lots of things that we're not taking into consideration, according to some people, but I don't believe that C-49 is really aimed at energy transition, other than a cosmetic aspect of changing the name of the regulating organizations. So other than that, I don't see any willingness on your part of government to get out of fossil energy. I don't know if you agree with me. Thank you, Mr. Simard. I think that you won't be surprised by my answer. I do not agree with you. Bill C-49 does not exist in isolation from the world. It's part of a set of financial measures that our government has put in place to encourage the development of green technology and renewable energy, and to reduce the support from the federal government to the fossil industry. We are the only G5 country to have reduced contributions to the carbon industry. And yet we're one of the biggest producers of fossil energies, fossil fuels rather. So, with regard to Mr. Mousseau's comments, as I was saying to Ms. Jones, the development of offshore wind energy, like on the land, has to go through an arbitration process. We have to study factors and land use, and it's all right. Thank you. I'm going to come back to what you just said. The unfortunate thing is that Canada is a prisoner of the fossil fuel sector. Now, you say that you've ended grants to the industry, but what you did was you ended effective, or that's not quite true. So you keep talking about reducing the carbon intensity but reducing the intensity, where you're going to putting millions of dollars into very difficult technology, carbon capture, for example. When we were in Berlin, I visited Siemens, and Siemens was telling us that producing hydrogen with the carbon capturing technology, they would never do that. But your government is heading towards that. And that's what Norman is saying. So you're putting clean energy in competition with fossil energy. And so when I look at the budget, I have the impression that it's fossil energy that's getting the biggest part of their share. And when I look at this bill, what I'm seeing is that it is a bit of a greenwashing. I don't know what it's going to cost to put in the infrastructure to distribute clean. Quebec is ahead of the game in this sector. I don't know how by putting dirty energy in competition with clean energy, how we're going to be able to develop that sector.
C'est un fait, le Canada est un grand producteur.
It's true. Canada is a big producer of gas and oil, and this is not a revolution. We're going to be providing less and less support for investment, and we're going to be investing more heavily in clean energies and renewable energy. Federal funding or federal resources have more than quadrupled in the last few years, after years of conservative governments. But we've committed to the transition, and I don't agree with you with regard to carbon capturing. That's not going to answer all our problems, and it's considered by many to be a critical technology. Now, grants for the fossil energy, what we've done is we've eliminated all the grants that go directly to oil and gas. Carbon storage is good for oil and gas, but this is not a grant that is targeting one industry. And I always talk about reducing our emissions in an absolute way.
So you'll get maybe another opportunity. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Angus from the New Democratic Party for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Guilbeault. You seem like you belong at our committee. We shall have a permanent seat for you. We'd love to have you come, and we could ask you all manner of questions. The issue of the transition 5 years ago, following it seemed that was hopeful and a bunch of ideas. The fact that it has moved so fast is really, I think, the surprising factor that, the Biden administration is now going to have twice the solar capacity by 2030 than they predicted 3 years ago. Their wind capacity will be 43% higher. This is then what they planned. They thought it was possible. It's happening. My concern, and I look at what's happening in Europe, Aberdeen, where my people are from, 42,000 new jobs, 1,500 last year in offshore wind. We've lost 45,000 jobs in the oil sector. We lost 1,500 this year at Suncor alone. There's a real sense from some people that I'm talking to that we're sitting at the side of the road while the rest of the world is moving ahead. How urgent is it that Canada's going to actually get in the game with our competitors on clean energy?
I agree with you. I think that the transition is happening faster than many had anticipated. Definitely the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States doesn't have a whole lot to do with inflation and a whole lot to do with the transition. Is an international game changer, and everyone has had to adapt their investment plan, fiscal plan in light of that. We've had to do that in Canada, and the Europeans, and the Japanese, and so many others. And it is creating an acceleration towards clean tech and renewable energy. And we want to be part of that, which is why we're investing massively, historic amounts in Canada in new technologies, in renewable electricity production, in transmission grids, which we will need to decarbonize in many parts of the country.
The issue here is that, you know, the scope of the offshore projects in the Atlantic, so our nearest competitors in the United States, I mean, these are massive projects. You know, one project alone, 700,000 homes, and we're still talking, and we've got our Conservative colleagues that don't want this bill to pass. Why would investors come to Canada if they don't see that these projects are moving ahead? We still don't have our tax credits in place. There's so many places you can go and invest. Why here if we can't get this up and running now?
I think investors and foreign investors are clearly looking and paying attention to what Canada's doing. We're the third in the world now for foreign direct investment, after the U.S. and Brazil, and that's on an absolute number. It's not per capita. Per capita, we are number one. So I think investors are looking at what we're doing and saying Canada's an interesting place to invest. I agree with you. We need to hurry up while we make sure that we do things properly in terms of consultations with Indigenous nations, with fishermen when it comes to offshore oil, which is what IAC has been doing. And I'm confident that both in terms of impact assessment, in terms of consultation, in terms of the fiscal framework, so the tax credits, by the end of this year, we will be in a position where we can start we can see project moving forward.
Thank you for that. I guess the question is also a question of accountability for what we have. You know, there's a recent report that came out that says that pollution coming out of the oil sands is 6,000 times higher than is officially reported. 6,000 times higher is a staggering number. Any other industry or any business, there'd be recalls. And yet, the Pathways Alliance spokesman said, quote, the oil sands industry measures the emissions using standards set by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So how is it that Climate Change Canada allowed such a vast discrepancy in terms of what's actually coming out and polluting and making people sick?
This is a very good question, and the monitoring of emissions, whether in that case volatile organic compounds or CO2 or methane, are the techniques to detect and measure these are ever evolving. In fact, you speak of that study that points to a 6,000% higher number than what is reported. Environment and Climate Change Canada was part of the group that made that study. So we invest massively as an institution to ensure that we have the best possible science when it comes to measuring these things. And now that we have this new science, we will be forced to take actions to make sure.
That's what I want to get to, because we also have a 2023 study that said methane emissions coming out of Alberta is underestimated by 50%, and I think we'd agree that methane is a planet killer. So you're talking about creating a cap. Is that cap going to include the new data on 6,000% higher emissions, or are we going to go on the cap on the previous data? Because if your data was that wrong, how do we reassure the public that we're going to have a plan in place to address what's actually coming out and affecting the planet?
So the study you refer to is not about greenhouse gas emissions, but it is about another form of pollutants. And I'm not saying it's less. It's not less important,
plus the other organics.
But in terms of methane, we used methodology that's developed by the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. We've just revised 2 years ago. We've redone all of our inventories based on new methane methodologies, and we will continue doing that as science evolves over time.
So will the cap include that new data?
Thank you.
The more up-to-date data will
Minister
be
and Mr. Angus for your round of questioning. I'm sure you'll get another opportunity to continue that line of questioning. We'll now move to the next round of 5 minutes with Mr. Small. Mr. Small, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Guilbeault, I'll ask you a similar question. I won't quote the question that I asked Mr. Tessier, but how important is stability and certainty of regulations in the worldwide energy in terms of investment? How important is it?
Can you specify the question? It's a rather broad question. I can give you a very broad answer, but do you have anything more specific?
You could give me a short, broad answer if you like, but how important is stability and certainty of regulations in the development and the investment in worldwide energy?
I mean, as I was telling your colleague, MP earlier, Canada ranks third in the world for foreign direct investment. That means that investors from all around the world are looking at all the investment opportunities they have, and they chose Canada as the top 3 place to do that. So I think that speaks volume about what investors. I can't speak on their behalf.
You know what?
But money talks.
In the Gulf of Mexico last year, nearly $400 million was committed to purchasing of offshore leases. And we had a record offering in Newfoundland and Labrador last year, and we had 0 purchases. One of the very few times in the history of our offshore oil and gas, in the year that we had record numbers of parcels offered up. Does that sound like confidence in Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas?
I can say it again. International investors are looking to Canada as one of the top places in the world to put their money. That's what we're seeing. And in terms of the oil and gas sector, you've seen probably the reports, as I have, from the International Energy Agency, or even our own independent energy regulator, that estimates that by the end of the decade, demand for oil and gas, firstly, will peak by around 2028. So I think investors are starting to wonder, if they should continue invest in the development.
I'm sure it warms the cockles of your heart to see what your party's done, your government's done,
about international
to destroy
figures,
the confidence in Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas industry. With Bill C-69, which we're waiting to see version 2 of it, because it's unconstitutional, and now it's referenced, over 30 times.
We have
this bill.
Point of order, Mr. Small. I'll ask you to hold. We have a point of order from Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, go ahead on your point of order.
Thank you. I'd like to point out to the committee in testimony last week by the CNLOPB, we asked if they felt that the industry was being held hostage by any legislation in this bill or previous bills, and they answered no, and the same was answered by the CNS as well.
Okay, colleagues, I want to hear the point of order from Ms. Jones. Colleagues, I'll ask you once again. I will ask you not to turn on your mics. I will ask you to speak as acknowledged by the chair. I've addressed this before, that our interpreters can't interpret when we have multiple microphones on. It's very difficult. So, if Mr. Patzer, if you let me finish, and hearing the point of order, and then I can rule on the point of order. Ms. Jones, I would just ask you on your point of order not to use it as debate, to provide the procedural relevance of your point of order. If there is a future point of order by yourself or anybody else on the committee, around the committee table. But colleagues, I would appreciate that you do not interrupt until I can hear enough to make a ruling on the point of order. Now we have a point of order from Mr. Angus. Mr. Angus, go ahead on the point of order.
Well, thank you, Chair. You just answered my question. I couldn't hear whether it was a point of. I've heard a lot of non-points of order over the year. I couldn't actually hear whether it was or not. So I was just asking you to let it so we could hear whether it's a point of order or not.
And I'll remind everybody once again: use a point of order in the procedural relevance, but also let the member speak enough so I can determine if it is a point of order and it's relevant or not. Thank you. We will now go back to where we were at with Mr.
I think I got 2 minutes left.
With Mr. Small.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's no question about how the oil and gas industry feels about the stability of regulations now in our offshore oil and gas industry. At least those who'd invest, because they invested nothing last year. So now we've got a lack of stability and clarity as to where the future lies for offshore oil and gas. So when you don't bring in the fishing industry and build in a framework that makes them comfortable, Do you think they won't be protesting if they're not consulted properly?
I answered that question before. I'd be happy to answer it again. As part of the regional impact assessment that has been that is being conducted by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, we have been meeting on a regular basis with a number of stakeholders. I took part in some of those consultations myself, including obviously fishermen from Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as Nova Scotia.
So, my question to you, Minister, is how do you identify where the prime fishing grounds are?
We work with a number of different federal departments, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We work with fishermen organizations to conduct that's what the regional impact assessment is about, to look at where is
it's collected
fishing currently happening.
Using vehicle or vessel monitoring system.
I think it'll be easier if I can answer the question. It'll be easier for me. What I was trying to explain is this: what the work of the environmental agency or the assessment agency is to work with.
Question, Minister.
It's up to you to decide whether I can answer the question or not.
Minister, to finish your answer, because I know you did go into French as well, and it takes a moment for the interpretation to kick in. So please go ahead and
What I was saying is that the environmental agency will identify fishing areas where there's already fishing being, and potential wind sites to see if there are conflicts, and if there are conflicts, how they can be addressed.
Thank you. We'll now go to our next round of questioning, and we will go to Ms. Lapointe. Ms. Lapointe, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Bonjour, Ministre.
Hello, Minister Guilbeault. Many Canadians have shared their concerns with me with regard to our energy, the network capabilities.
My apologies. I'm going to ask you to hold for a second. Are you able to close your blind, because it does impact the ability of the interpreters to interpret, to see you as you speak, or that's actually good. Thank you. That will work. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was very happy to hear witnesses last Monday say that offshore wind could provide energy to the grids right up until Ontario. So I was happy to hear that. Could you tell us how the offshore energy will increase the availability of electricity, and how this bill would allow us to further decarbonize the network? Thank you for your question, Ms. Lapointe. So yes, what we do know is what we anticipate is by 2050 we'll have to at least double the size of our grid in Canada in terms of production and transmission and distribution, which is about the same for all the G7 partners, the United States, Japan. And what we anticipate as well is that most, and I was saying this earlier, is that 90% of new energy, according to will come from renewable energies. And that's where the wind potential, the offshore wind potential comes, especially from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. It becomes a very interesting prospect. And what we're anticipating, and we'll see what happens in the coming years, but the potential production could surpass the local needs and maybe even regional needs in terms of electric consumption. So there will be an opportunity for those provinces to export clean energy towards other provinces like Quebec, and you had mentioned Ontario as well. And that's why, in addition to all the works that the assessment agency is doing to prepare the grounds in terms of developing wind energy, we're also working with a number of other Atlantic provinces. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Labrador on strengthening the electrical grid so that we can increase the transmission capacity of those problems to other provinces, the provinces toward the west. Outside of Atlantic Canada, does C90, does this bill have an impact on the rest of Canada in terms of the supply chain, for example? That's a good question. The development of offshore wind will have a beneficial impact on a number of other regions in Canada. And we can think of Gaspé, for example, where there's already an industrial capacity that's significant, and it's close to the region, it's close to ports, and it's close to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. There's engineering work that will be able to be done in those provinces, and skills will be able to come from other provincial provinces. So there are benefits that far surpass the region of the Atlantic Canada.
Clean energy is necessary, and we know that the world will move ahead without us. We've talked about that a lot at this committee. And so I think it's imperative for Canada to lead and to define our clean energy future. If Canada doesn't increase clean energy projects like the offshore projects in Atlantic Canada, what do we stand to lose in terms of jobs and economic opportunities for future generations?
The potential economic and job loss fallout of not moving to a cleaner electricity grid. I mean, we already have a pretty clean one, and that's a competitive advantage. But the reality is that, as you know, Wayne Gretzky used to say, you need to skate where the puck will be and not where the puck is. And right now, this is a competitive advantage, but everyone is investing to decarbonize their grid, so we need to continue doing that. The reason we've been able to attract in Canada business deals like Volkswagen, Stellantis, Northvolt is because of our clean grid. And that's one of the main reasons why these companies say they're coming to Canada. But unless we continue to invest in decarbonization of our grid, we will lose that competitive advantage to some of our economic competitors because they are making this move. So we could put at risk tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of investments in Canada.
Right on time. Time is up. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe and Monsieur Guilbeault for answering the questions. We'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Mr. Guilbeault, I know that you probably agreed on the project, Baie du Nord project, and you were necessarily agreed and totally agree with it. But there are issues with marine biodiversity. Some permits will be given in marine refuges. And we've talked about this on a few occasions of the caribou question in Quebec. So I think there's a double standard here. So in my view, and I understand that caribou is a complex issue, but the forest sector allows us to capture carbon. It allows us to reduce the intensity of our emissions. So I would like to hear what you have to say. Do you have any concerns in terms of the preservation of marine biodiversity? Yes, I do. And that's why Canada agreed to host COP15, and we came to an historic agreement, the Montreal Agreement on Biodiversity, that specifies that we will have to protect at least 30% of our land and oceans by 2030. So since we have to do it on land, we're going to have to make choices on the types of development that we develop in the ocean as well. And we'll have to do arbitration. And you know like me that all human activity has an impact on the environment. There's not anything, the wind farms or anything like that. What we have to do is choose activities that we decide to support that have less and less impact, and that's the role that we have to take. All right. The problem is, I mean, you've had to make choices, but when it comes to making choices and doing arbitration, well, the oil and gas sector often wins. You were quick to ask Quebec to make a proposal on Caribou, and on a number of occasions you even talked about going to making a decree. But I never heard you say the same type of thing, to be as stringent when you're talking about marine refuges. So Canada is entrapped by oil and gas.
Please, because we are over just at time.
Ça me fera plaisir de faire un suivi.
I'd be happy to follow up, but we put in place new directives with regard to marine protection areas and even oil and gas exploration. We could follow up with your office in writing.
We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know of another time when we've been so dependent on looking at what the Americans are doing, but the Biden administration is really setting the mark that we are either going to be in the game or not. And recently, the Biden administration did something very surprising. They put a pause on LNG. President Biden said the pause on new LNG sees the climate crisis for what it is, the existential threat of our time, because we know LNG is 90% methane. There's a lot of leakage along the whole way. And then he said that the Republicans who are supporting ever-expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, quote, willfully deny the urgency of the climate crisis, and I certainly know my colleagues in the Conservatives are there. But I guess I'm going to ask you, is Canada willing to put a moratorium on LNG because of the issues of methane and the leakage and the fact that we are having to deal with the climate crisis at every level?
Thank you for the question. As you know, the constitutional powers for the federal government versus the states in the United States is different than what it is in Canada. We don't have power over the development of energy projects, but where we can and are acting is on the pollution. In the CAP, the framework that was announced in December, we have announced that emissions from LNG terminals would come under the oil and gas cap that we're in the process of putting in place.
No. My colleague from Cumberland Colchester made a pretty declarative statement that there was absolutely no economic case for hydrogen, and he said that everybody knows that. I met with the German Chancellor. He seemed to think that Canadian hydrogen was very interesting to him. Can you say what your government's view is? Is there an opportunity for hydrogen in Atlantic Canada, in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and making jobs? Is there a case economically for hydrogen, or is the Conservatives right that this is just another crazy scheme and we shouldn't be supporting it?
I've also had the pleasure of speaking with the German Chancellor and the Deputy Chancellor on this, and certainly when it comes to Germany and to many other European countries, there is a very high level of interest in the potential for Canada to produce hydrogen using renewable energy, like the project that we're seeing in Newfoundland, which for reasons that elude me is opposed by the Conservative Party of Canada. This is a first. I believe that we will see many other of these type of projects moving forward.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Patzer for 5 minutes. Mr. Patzer, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for coming today, Minister, and I'll just correct your dishonest opinion about the Conservative Party. We do actually support
Mr. Chair, point of order.
the
we have a
provinces
point
to
of
be able
order,
to-
Mr. Patzer. We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson.
It's unparliamentary to actually refer to someone as being dishonest. It's just not correct language to be using in a committee.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. On your point of order, colleagues, I would ask that we not use language that is unparliamentary or an accusation of accusing a member. So if you could proceed with your questioning, Mr. Patzer, and just be a little bit more careful on some of the words you use. Go ahead.
Sure. Your misleading statement that Conservatives don't support offshore wind development, that's actually factually incorrect. We do support the province's ability to develop whatever types of resources that they want. What we do object to is government legislation that is going to hamstring the province's ability to do that. This bill has no less than 30 references to the unconstitutional parts of the Impact Assessment Act. And Conservatives want to see this bill corrected so that way there won't have to be a constitutional challenge to it because of the fact that there's largely unconstitutional parts referenced in this bill. So, Minister, when will you fix the Impact Assessment Act so that it is indeed constitutional?
I would beg to differ in your characterization of this bill in regards to provincial powers. I have here a quote from Premier Andrew Furey. Newfoundland and Labrador is perfectly positioned in the green energy transition. Part of that transition requires offshore wind so our province can become a world leader in green hydrogen. We continue to support the Government of Canada on Bill C-49. That doesn't seem to me like we're forcing someone to do something. Then another quote from Premier Tim Houston.
Minister.
Bill C-49 is a necessary first step in unlocking our energy potential. There will be many steps along the road, but we are hopeful that Bill C-49 passes so we can get started. Coming from a Conservative premier.
Because there are certain regulations that are in this bill that are needed and necessary. We all know that, but what we also know is that there is over 30 references to the unconstitutional elements of the Impact Assessment Act that so far your government has done absolutely nothing to address that. So one more time, Minister, just quickly, when will you fix the Impact Assessment Act so that it is constitutional?
You said that there were elements in this bill that were needed and supported by Atlantic premiers, yet you continue to say you will vote against this bill. I find these two statements to be difficult to reconcile.
Minister, if this bill passes as it is, it will be unconstitutional because of the largely unconstitutional parts about it. So that's a pretty obvious reason why you would vote against this bill, because there will be continued uncertainty for investors, also for the provinces. The provinces want this bill because there are updates to the regulations that need to happen. We all get that. We all agree with that. One more time, what is the date that you'll fix the Impact Assessment Act so that it is constitutional, so that there will be certainty for investors to come and invest in offshore wind off Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia?
I don't know if you took the time to read the opinion of the Supreme Court on the Impact Assessment Act, but the Supreme Court specifically said that there were elements of the Impact Assessment Act that were very constitutional, and there are elements on which we need to work. And my government and my department, in collaboration with Parks Canada and the Impact Assessment Agency, will be coming forward very shortly with amendments to the Impact Assessment Act.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing when those are, because I think that will be needed for this bill to actually pass without there being any issues, as your former Bill C-69 has encountered. Now, Minister, does the government measure the annual amount of emissions that are directly reduced from the federal carbon tax?
Absolutely. We produced a report before Christmas that's publicly available, and we produced an annual report called the Greenhouse Gas Inventory Report, which measures where Canada is in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. You will be pleased to know that since we've come into power in 2015, we've managed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 7% below our 2015 levels, where when we came into power, they were going to be 12% above the 2015 level by 2030.
So, Minister, you just told a completely different version of an answer that you already previously gave. You said that the government does not measure the annual amount of emissions that are directly reduced by federal carbon pricing. So it seems we've got two different versions of the facts here. So I am very much aware that the government produces the National Inventory Report. Now, the last year that is available is 2021, which shows that emissions actually went up over 2020. But you also recall that 2020 and 2021, the country was locked down. So the only reason why your emissions went down is because the country was undergoing massive lockdowns and people were not traveling due to the COVID pandemic.
Mr. Patzer, time is up. I'll just ask the Minister for a brief response.
We were no longer in a pandemic in 2021, and Canada has the best performance of all G7 countries, and our emissions in 2021 were below 2019 before the pandemic.
Thank you, Minister. We have our final round of questioning from Mr. Batiste for 5 minutes. Welcome to committee, Mr. Batiste. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to start off by reading something to the record because I want to correct the record. And as part of the honor of being the Member of Parliament from Sydney, Victoria, I get to represent the Mi'kmaq community of Membertou, which is a part of the Everwind project. And the Everwind CEO said that without the passage of C-49, a powerful message will be sent to industry that politics killed a critical green industry and denied Atlantic Canada a chance to join economies around the world investing in offshore wind. We implore our political leaders to support this critical work with the passage of Bill C-49. And I know that the minister has just read off that the premiers are very much in support of this in the Atlantic. We have Indigenous communities calling for it, as well as industry. And so it seems like there is quite a bit of support for this. And I just wanted to correct the record from what the Conservatives were saying on this. But also I wanted to contrast a little bit their general narrative towards this legislation, starting off, Minister Guilbeault, by thanking you for your environmental activism in your life. As a Mi'kmaq person, I have grown up with the Indigenous knowledge that we are connected to the land and we belong to it, and we consider ourselves the original stewards of the land. And within our language, we have a word called Nedugalimk that makes it clear that we have a duty and a responsibility to our environment. And like yourself, I was an activist. I remember during the Conservative Harper era being a part of the Idle No More protests out there when the Conservatives had gutted environmental regulations and when they had failed to protect our oceans. In fact, they've only protected 1% of the oceans that were out there. And I wonder if you could give a little bit of a sense of why is it important for us to take steps to protect our oceans, to ensure that we are reaching our goal of protecting 30% of our marine protected areas by 2030, and why this is going to have a tremendous benefit not only to the world but to the Atlantic.
Thank you for the question. I obviously agree with the statement that you read for the first part. The goal that was adopted in Montreal at the end of 2022 at COP15 of protecting at least 30% of land and waters by 2030 is not a goal a number that was picked out of a hat. It's based on a number of international scientific studies that shows that this is a minimum. So it's not a floor. It's not a ceiling. It's a floor. It's the minimum that is needed to help our ecosystems globally start to recuperate from decades of overuse of our natural resources across the globe. And if we want our kids and grandkids to have access to a healthy planet, clean water, clean air, less impacts of climate change, this is the first thing that we need to do. There's many things we need to do, but this is the first step. Nature in our fight against climate change is our biggest ally.
Thank you for that, Minister. And I can't help but, as a Cape Breton Member of Parliament, really, when your words talking about our fight against climate change, we're dealing with day 4 of an extreme weather event in Cape Breton where we've seen more than 150 centimeters of snow, something that no one in the elders in my community or that in our records can show that this has ever happened before. This is just 16 to 18 months after Hurricane Fiona that we had never seen before, and we're seeing rivers wash away on the Cabot Trail because of climate change. Why is it? What are the steps we're taking now doing to address what's going to be happening later? Because we know that climate change is real. We know that it's happening, and it's hitting coastal communities harder than most areas. And why is it so important for us to do the work we're doing and the work you're doing for the environment?
Well, 3 things I'd like to say. I mean, first, we can't fight climate change unless we reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels. And that's in Canada, and that's around the world. That's number one. So we need to reduce our emissions. Number 2, we need to have a strategy to prepare Canada and Canadians for the impacts of climate change. They're here. We're seeing them. You mentioned many of them. We could talk about the forest fires across the country. We could talk about the droughts that we're seeing in the prairies. And right now in Alberta, we're talking about rationing water because of low precipitation. But the third thing I'd like to say is just before Christmas, the Conservative Party voted against a $500 million program to support victims of natural catastrophes. So I find that unconscionable, that they would prevent money to go for people who need it in times of need as we face ever increasing impacts of climate change.
Thank you, MP Batiste, for your line of questioning, and Minister, for your answers today. Thank you for joining us for a full hour. It's always great to see you come to the Natural Resources Committee, and thank you to all officials who also have come to join the Minister. You're also all welcome back again. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you again, Minister. Have a great evening. Colleagues, we'll now suspend to change panels. I call this meeting back to order pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, and the adopted motion of Wednesday, December 13th, 2023. The committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-49, an act to amend the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act, and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. In accordance with our routine motion, I'm informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting, but we do have two witnesses providing testimony that are still undergoing their connection tests. So we will start with our first speaker today while the others get everything in order, and hopefully it's in good working condition when they begin. Our witness for the second hour, Fish Food and Allied Workers Union, Katie Power, Industry Relations Representative. We also have Oceans North, Susanna Fuller, Vice President, Operations and Projects. And from Sea Blue Canada, Jennifer Jossenhans, National Coordinator. We will begin with Katie Power from the Fish Food and Allied Workers Union. You have 5 minutes for an opening statement. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of over 14,000 of our members from Newfoundland and Labrador, thank you for the opportunity to address the Standing Committee on Bill C-49. The Fish Food and Allied Workers Union represents every inshore fish harvester in our province, encompassing approximately 3,000 owner-operator enterprises and over 7,000 crew members. As the union representing fish harvesters and processing workers, FFAW is a primary advocate for the economic and social growth of coastal communities throughout our province. Today, as the sole fisheries representative from Newfoundland and Labrador to address the Standing Committee on this bill, I'm here to underscore the concerns expressed by other regions and share critical perspective for mitigating potential impacts to the inshore fishery for our province. I will note I was given approximately 24 hours notice to speak today. This feels dismissive and rushed, which is comparable to the legislation to be discussed. Our inshore fishery contributes over $1 billion annually to the provincial economy from a renewable and historically significant marine resource. Offshore wind expansion has a direct impact on fish harvesters who will be faced with competition for ocean space and absolutely affected by new infrastructure. Co-location and coexistence of the existing commercial fishery and new offshore wind represents a major unanswered concern for our province's fishing industry. To clarify, FFAW in its representation of the owner-operator fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador has not been consulted or engaged by governments or otherwise on Bill C-49, but serves to be directly impacted by it. In the absence of the appropriate consultation framework not currently built into this bill for adherence, undue conflict among fisheries stakeholders, other ocean user groups, future investors, and developers of offshore wind is inevitable. FFAW has been thoroughly engaged in the ongoing regional assessment for offshore wind. Participation on both the staff and harvester level has been immense, reflective of the magnitude of potential impacts and indicative of a desire to be involved. However, this regional assessment has no application in this legislation, and the recommendations of the Regional Assessment Committee to governments are not legally binding. This, coupled with the complete lack of communication from local governments, leaves the fishing industry with no reassurance, no safeguards for mitigation, and an overall lack of trust or faith in the process as it is presently being pursued. Had our provincial government participated in any aspect of the regional assessment, it would be profoundly aware of the vocal opposition to offshore wind in our province at this time. Insufficient communication and the lack of transparency for offshore wind means we must look to other jurisdictions for support. FFAW has met with existing players in offshore wind to better understand the realities of fisheries interactions. Most recently, we met with Exodus Group, a global energy consultancy with interests in Boston and Scotland. Their take-home message was entirely in hindsight, explaining that they had done things wrong, and in Canada, we have a great opportunity to learn from their mistakes. They said the fishing industry must be deeply engaged in the earliest phases of offshore wind to increase trust and understanding and to ensure all avoidance mitigations can proceed. The fishing industry will be the most disrupted as the succession of the industry relies on sustainable practices that preserve biodiversity and sensitive habitat conditions. Subversion of this habitat, which is often irrevocable, will directly cause the displacement of valuable fisheries. Governments must ensure they support locally relevant research initiatives ahead of any installations and thoughtfully and meaningfully consider fisheries as a priority. From a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective, none of which has occurred. Our province is unique in many ways, perhaps the most prolific being our geography as an island. Our rural coastal communities have relied on fish harvesting to provide sustenance and economic stability for generations, and this practice continues as a vibrant industry. Insights and experiential knowledge provided by fish harvesters will serve as an invaluable resource, and it is reckless and irresponsible to jeopardize this rural reliance given the vast uncertainty of potential negative effects. FFAW members in coastal communities will be negatively and disproportionately affected if their fishing grounds are displaced by offshore wind, and without a robust plan for potential workforce transitions, these communities risk collapse. In closing, it is grossly dismissive of the adjacent fishing industry to assume a bill written for the oil and gas sector can be cut and pasted into a bill for an entirely new and fundamentally different renewable energy sector. Appropriate and concise language on how fisheries groups may be compensated for losses is virtually non-existent and discredits the value and importance of our industry completely. As elected officials, you have a fundamental responsibility to protect the valuable resources that those affected rely on for economic prosperity. While I understand the CNSOPB has a Fisheries Advisory Committee for fisheries consultation, no such entity exists in Newfoundland and Labrador or within the CNLOPB. The ocean topography, the coastlines, commercial species, their distributions in our respective provinces are vastly different and need to be approached as such. We have no mechanism to support imperative consultations for offshore wind and fishing industries, and to date, there have been none. We fear the committee may pass this bill without sufficient and necessary meaningful consultations. As a key stakeholder, FFAW Unifor is committed to all consultations that will be required moving forward in support of a just transition to greener, less fossil fuel dependent technologies. However, the growth of one industry cannot be at the expense of another. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statement. Colleagues, we'll just suspend for a moment to do a connection test for the other two witnesses. Okay, we're back. We will now go to Susanna Fuller from Oceans North for your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I do work for Oceans North as the VP of Conservation and Projects, but I also grew up in rural Nova Scotia, and I sit as an advisor to the Minister of Environment in Nova Scotia on the Roundtable for the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act. And about 10 years ago, almost exactly, I had the pleasure of releasing an economic report for Nova Scotia that really spoke to having to take some leaps and bounds of faith as we move forward in changing the economic outcomes and futures for Atlantic Canada. So I'm very appreciative of speaking to you today and this important bill. I think we want to express our general support for the amendments to the Atlantic Accord Agreements as proposed in Bill C-49. We hear the concerns of our colleagues in the fishing industry and look forward to working with them to make sure that there are adequate community benefits and consultation. And there's many lessons learned around the world, from as nearby as Rhode Island to across the pond in Scotland, how to make sure that communities benefit and that fishermen are the beneficiaries rather than impacted by new industries in the ocean. So our support comes from the following interests and areas of work. The first is on advocating and demonstrating the potential for zero emissions marine industries and the necessity for energy transition. And the second is to strengthen the protection standards for the marine protected areas that we have put in place, often in collaboration with and working closely with the fishing industry. So on the first item, we are involved in the regional assessment process for offshore wind in both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And we are advocating, again, as I mentioned, for community benefits, but really also thinking about the opportunities for the marine industries and inshore fisheries in particular, to start to electrify nearshore workboats and then start to build out this bi-directional charging infrastructure at fishing wharves. And offshore wind can help us do that as long as the communities who are close by are the beneficiaries of some of that energy. We know that we need to do projects differently than in the past. The recent and landmark Blueberry decision in BC requires the Impact Assessment Act and project proponents to address cumulative environmental impacts at all stages of projects. We're not seeing this yet as part of the regional assessment, and we need to. Bill C-49 can help with this. We also must work with the communities, as we mentioned, to make sure that they are benefiting from public resources. We know that electricity prices are going up, and we know that in Atlantic Canada, we rely on oil more than any other.
Sorry, Ms. Fuller, we're getting we're getting a signal from interpretation that it's your sound quality is not up to the level they need to interpret. So what I would ask you to do is to send a brief with your opening statement to the clerk, which you may already have done so we can.
I have done that,
we can provide that.
Yeah, I've done that.
Which we will translate and distribute to members.
Okay. Do you want me to stop now, or do you want me to just continue more slowly?
You can stay on. Unfortunately, we will have to ask you to
point of order.
Stop at this point. But I'll ask you to hold for a sec. We have a point of order from Mr. Angus.
Well, given that we're getting testimony on what's happening, the provincial regional assessment is really important. Is there a way that we can actually do another test? Because what I feel I'm being left out is a chance to ask questions. I can read her brief, but I want to find out more details about the provincial assessment process and whether or not the feds are living up to it or how it works. So not having her testimony would be very problematic.
So what we can do, I understand your testimony is important. You can provide it. If you could, if you could provide your questions and we can get a response back. I know it can be challenging or difficult, but unfortunately, we do need interpretation for colleagues to be able to all participate. And I'm going to ask you to hold, Ms. Fuller, I'm just going to ask you to hold for a moment. We do have another point of order from Mr. Patzer.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if there's any way we could take 20 seconds. I noticed she adjusted the boom on her mic down a considerable amount, so I do think there's a chance that her interpretation might be clear now. I'm just wondering if we could just offer the quick 20-second courtesy to try again quickly and then make a determination.
We'll try that, Ms. Fuller. We're going to suspend and recheck. So we'll suspend.
of Sea Blue Canada, I would also like to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide input on Bill C-49. For some context, Sea Blue Canada is a coalition of 8 of Canada's most active and well-respected environmental non-government organizations. We work collaboratively to ensure that Canada's marine protected area commitments are ambitious, equitable, and ultimately provide meaningful protection to marine species and habitats. This is not only for the health of the animals and plants within the ocean, but also the people on the coast and beyond who rely on the ocean for their well-being. I am the national coordinator, and I will speak on behalf of the coalition, outlining the key points from our written submission. And while I'm here to provide input through the lens of a coalition working on supporting the delivery of the government's marine conservation targets, on a personal note, I'm also a resident of Nova Scotia, more specifically the small coastal town of Lunenburg, and have a vested personal interest in maintaining the health of the ocean in Atlantic Canada and also beyond. Many livelihoods within my town rely on a healthy ocean, and our community can only thrive when the seas around us thrive. Let me preface by saying Sea Blue Canada supports the development of marine renewable energy as part of the clean energy response to the climate crisis. However, marine renewable energy projects must be managed responsibly and sustainably to minimize impacts to the marine environment and in a way that benefits local communities. Furthermore, to address the climate crisis, the introduction of marine renewable energy in Canada must be complemented by an equitable transition away from offshore oil and gas production. Sea Blue Canada supports the amendments, specifically those amendments proposed under clauses 26 to 28 and 135 to 137 in the bill that would protect the marine environment by enabling the prevention of offshore oil and gas and renewable energy activities within areas that have been identified for conservation or protection. These amendments are essential to protect marine biodiversity and will also help to facilitate the clean energy transition through the development of offshore renewable energy while supporting marine wildlife. We strongly believe that these two priorities can coexist and are indeed compatible. Bill C-49 and the Offshore Accord Acts that it amends form an important part of Canada's ocean management framework and will contribute to achieving Canada's conservation goals on the Atlantic coast. As you will know, and as has been referenced earlier in the session, Canada has committed to protecting 25% of the ocean by 2025, to working towards protecting 30% by 2030, and to working to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. In line with the federal minimum protection standard, incidentally announced exactly 1 year ago today at Impact 5, the federal government has committed to prohibiting oil and gas activities within all new federal MPAs and avoid or mitigate industrial activities that pose risks to biodiversity outcomes within OECMs. There is significant evidence to support that oil and gas activities are incompatible with marine conservation, as well as a growing body of evidence that indicates that offshore renewable energy products can have the potential to impact marine ecosystems without careful management. Notably, there is no legal mechanism under the current Offshore Accord Acts to allow for the surrender or cancellation of oil and gas leases within areas set aside for environmental protection. Bill C-49 would address this gap by enabling the federal and provincial governments to pass regulations that prohibit offshore oil and gas or renewable energy projects within areas that have been identified for protection. It would also allow the government to negotiate for the surrender of interests within these areas. The passing of this legislation with these provisions will allow the Government of Canada and provincial governments to demonstrate their strong commitment to marine protection and assure stakeholders that the government has the legal tools required to ensure that protected areas are truly protected. There is currently no explicit or clear law or policy in Canada that addresses offshore renewable energy in MPAs. Bill C-49 would provide Canada and the Atlantic provinces with the legal tools to sustainably and responsibly manage offshore renewable energy in the Offshore Accord Act areas and set a precedent for a similar legislative framework in the rest of Canada's ocean estate. In conclusion, Sea Blue Canada recommends that the committee pass Bill C-49 in a timely manner to ensure that these marine conservation provisions may be implemented as soon as possible and in time for Canada to achieve its conservation targets for 2025. On behalf of the coalition, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the committee for the opportunity to present our views, and we very much look forward to seeing the proposed offshore renewable energy provisions in Bill C-49 passed into law. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statement. Colleagues, just remind everybody, I'll be using these cards. Yellow is 30-second warning, red is time's up. We will start, and I think we'll get through one round here with Mr. Small from the Conservative Party of Canada for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is to Ms. Josenhans. Ms. Josenhans, are you in favor of wind farms going inside marine protected areas?
So speaking on, thank you very much for the question, first of all, and speaking on behalf of the coalition.
Just a short answer because I just have a few minutes here.
Thank you. We do believe that marine protected areas, that offshore energy should be scoped out of marine protected areas because with proper marine spatial planning, we believe these two things can coexist.
Thank you for that answer. So I'm going to direct my next question to Katie Power. Katie, you just heard Ms. Josenhans' testimony there, and you heard the minister earlier. And how do you compare the interaction of the fishing industry with oil and gas offshore to what you see going on worldwide with the between the fishing industry and offshore renewables?
Thank you for the question. I think if I understand it correctly, my response would be that globally and comparably to our experience with the oil and gas industry traditionally in Newfoundland and Labrador with fisheries is that we have been pushed out and forced out of fishing grounds. As an example, we can look at the Grand Banks as traditional cod grounds that we no longer have access to. And this is very similar to areas in the offshore near Scotland and in these other places we've consulted with that the fishing grounds where wind turbines now stand are not accessible to fisheries. The gear is not compatible amongst the turbines. The access, the grounds for the fishing activity has been totally lost in a lot of instances.
So I'll ask you this: how does the scale compare when you look at spatial considerations? How does the scale compare of the ground coverage of wind energy versus, say, an oil production platform?
Wind farms are vastly more large. They take up an immense, thousands of square kilometers of space offshore.
So, have you heard about how prime fishing grounds are being identified? Have you heard anything coming out from your counterparts in the Maritimes about how areas of interest are being sorted out?
I'm not entirely familiar. I have been wholly focused on the Newfoundland and Labrador process, and we haven't even been given an opportunity to do such in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I wouldn't be able to answer with certainty on how processes are going elsewhere, but to my experience, we're not even that far yet.
So what we're told by the fishing industry in Nova Scotia is that VMS data is being used to identify areas of high-intensity fishing. Do inshore lobster and halibut boats use VMS data?
Using VMS data to identify areas of high fishing concentrations is not helpful, in particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador. It will miss essentially our entire membership, as we are representative of the inshore fleets, which are small boats or your less than 35 footers, and those vessels are not required to have AIS technology. So none of their fishing activity is recorded through DFO fishing science data. And then there would be no record, of course, to use when you're spatially planning to overlap these fishing areas. There's no way to capture that data if you use VMS.
So Ms. Power, if this is not done right, do you foresee some conflict between the fishing industry and renewables?
I think without the proper consultation processes and the enhanced measures that are clearly required that are not being conducted right now, conflict is inevitable because there are complete fisheries that are being dismissed and not acknowledged in these processes, and frankly ignored is the sentiment of our membership. And it's scary for them because their voices are not being heard, and their concerns, and they want to be engaged, they want to be involved. There's just this enhanced level of communication with our industry in Newfoundland and Labrador is not happening.
So I'm just going to finish off with one little. Well, you may want to provide a written submission on this, but I'm going to ask you this. What would you and your stakeholders like to see in terms of consultation and compensation framework built into C49? What does that need to look like? And I think it's going to be very important if we're to have the amendments to this bill that gives stability to offshore wind and to the fishing industry. I think it's going to be very important for yourselves to be involved in creating some amendments, which I would support. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll say that
Ms. Power, time is up, and as the member stated, it might be a lengthy brief you might be providing to provide lots of context there, so you're happy to, you can provide that. I will ask you just to move your mic a little bit higher, just raise it a tad higher. Yeah, that's good. I think that should be good. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Jones for 6 minutes. Ms. Jones, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of our witnesses today for the tremendous presentations. I think you all gave us lots of great insight and information, and we certainly appreciate that. I'm going to start my questions with you, Katie, from my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador. As you know, I grew up in the fishery, and I understand it very well. I'm really disappointed to learn that the FFAW was not consulted in a much more in-depth way. It does disappoint me, I'll be honest with you, and I really believe that the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador has been strong supporters of the offshore oil and gas industry, and have worked very well together as ocean industries to see those developments go in different directions. So I understand the important role that the FFAW plays, and I want to note that for the record here in committee today, and to say that I agree you should have been consulted in a much more in-depth way. And I know that you're at the table with the regional assessments. And I know that it's not the same as being consulted on the bill or being consulted on a project down the road. But first of all, I'd like to ask you, were you aware of the bill, and have there been discussions with your members inside of FFAW about it?
I was made aware of the bill. I believe we received an overview presentation in October. That, I think, was my first sort of introduction to what was going on. And then, of course, these proceedings, that's essentially been what's been brought to FFAW as an organization in terms of what's happening, where it's going. I was aware that the processes were ongoing and the bill was being written, but in terms of anything else, it's been very, it's very much seemed, I'll echo your sentiment, in disappointment, in that we very much have felt like an afterthought in a lot of the planning for this legislation.
So obviously I can't change what has happened, but as a member on the committee, I'm happy to work with the government to set up any kind of consultations or briefing that your organization might like to have in advance of, any votes that would take place in the House of Commons. So I make that offer to you, and I'm happy to do my best as one MP to try and arrange that. My other questions, I guess, are around the regional assessment process. I understood the regional assessment process was, although a different platform, a good opportunity for a number of stakeholders to feed into what the initial piece would look like in offshore wind. So have you been engaged at that level at all? And, are you a part of that process?
Yes, we've been deeply engaged in that process from the very beginning, as it's really been our only opportunity to provide feedback on offshore wind, to ask questions. And there has also been some challenges within the regional assessment process. Due to the unique demographic of Newfoundland and Labrador, our coastal communities and these rural outport communities where people with concerns about offshore wind live, the virtual meetings and computer literacy has presented as very challenging for our membership. That's been a major concern. The overall lack of trust in transparency that's been given by governments has kind of hindered the collection process as well. We've been getting a lot of apprehension from our membership in terms of being more forthcoming with information because they don't know how it's going to be used, what it's going to be used for, because there's a clear lack of understanding of the intentions of the regional assessment, how it will be used, because there's been no transparency. We've been very much left in the dark in this process, and I really think that it's giving the regional assessment and perhaps this legislation, it's doing it a disservice and a discredit because it's really unfortunate how it's kind of unfolded.
Yeah. So Bill C-49, the amendments is around a regulatory process. So we had the offshore oil and gas industry. We had a regulatory process which we set up the CNLOPB, which they set up the One Ocean concept, of which you're a part of, and they consult back and forth. This bill is basically focused on offshore wind. I know that, and there may be different factors, but we're looking again at a regulatory process. And I think the reason the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, and you might want to have this discussion with them, but my understanding is the reason they want the amendments in the bill is so that if they decide to move forward with offshore wind at some point, that there is a regulatory body in place that can work with all the different groups and organizations to ensure that people's interests are protected. So in passing this bill, we're not saying we're going to put a wind farm in Bonavista Bay tomorrow or in the Gulf but I think what we're doing is laying a regulatory process. So any wind development would still go through an environmental assessment process. And so one of the things I want to bring up today is there will be some amendments coming in the bill to ensure stakeholder engagement. So if there are other amendments that you'd like to look at for your members, we'll be happy to entertain those at the committee as well. I mean, we are open to suggestions and making sure that we make it strong and protect the interests of fishers as well as those that want to see clean energy grids and offshore wind developed. So I just want to let you know that and let you know that there is other opportunities to strengthen this to ensure that your members are protected.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, for your round of questions and Ms. Power for your answers. We'll now go to our next member, Monsieur Simard, for 6 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Powers, I understand that you were not sufficiently consulted as part of this bill, and I find that deplorable. I'm from Quebec, and I may not have a total comprehension of your area of activity, but I like what you said at the end of your presentation. You said that an industry cannot be done at the detriment of another industry, and that you have the impression that we're developing wind at the expense of fisheries. So, and I just encourage you to send us amendments to the bill. Now, I don't know if you conducted consultations within the group that you represent, but if you could you could pass that on to us and give us the feedback from your group. I personally commit to reflect on the documentation that you send us, and then we can make changes. But I think it's a bit late in the process, though. It's unfortunate that the government did not take the time to consult you, but your voice has been heard. I don't know if you want to add something.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I understand that it is late to rewrite, and we had been of the position that we owe it to the fishery and to all other ocean users to write new legislation specific and directly involving and engaging this situation and in renewable energy as to not do a disservice and to fully support the industries in the right way possible.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Okay, maybe a quick question for Ms. Josenhams now. In your presentation, I thought I understood that you were hoping that Bill C-49 be adopted quickly. But I don't know, when I read the bill, I see that we put on the same footing renewable energy and the hydrocarbon sector. And if this is a bill that's supposed to deal with a transition, we should have clear indications in the bill of a progressive going away from fossil fuels. So that doesn't seem to be what the government is doing. The government decided to give new drilling permits. So I don't know if you have amendment ideas that could allow us to equalize things a bit. So renewable energies, whether it's wind energy in this case or other forms of and fossil fuels.
Thank you very much for the question. And so I should be very specific that my remit here today is to speak about the coalition, and the coalition's mandate is very specific to the marine conservation targets as promised by the Government of Canada. So while our groups as separate entities work on things like renewable energy, the just energy transition, and a lot of the topics that are more specific to what you're asking, our statement was really focused on how this legislation will move along the marine conservation targets, specifically the ability of the federal government and the provinces to work together to rescind existing oil and gas leases. So while I would love to comment on that personally, speaking for the coalition, I can't really give a specific answer, for which I apologize. But thank you for the question.
Merci, je comprends.
Thank you. I understand. I would still like to know this, though. Now, if the objective of your coalition is to present targets for marine conservation, do you have data that you could provide us with, or that provide the committee with, on the effects on biodiversity of exploratory drilling? Do you have any data in that regard?
We do. In the brief that we submitted, the key points which I summarized in my opening statement, we go into a little bit more detail on the effects of oil and gas on marine biodiversity, as well as some of the effects of renewable energy installations on marine biodiversity. But if you would require any information outside of what we have submitted or any more detail, I'd be more than happy to provide that. So please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Effectivement, vous pouvez peut-être fournir.
Yes, so if you could provide that to the committee, that would be helpful. And I would invite Ms. Power as well to provide amendments if she wishes to. I invite you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 6 minutes. Mr.
Thank
Angus,
you
the floor is yours.
Thank you to our witnesses. This has all been very excellent. This legislation is being driven very much by the Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia government. So we're at a point where if there's concerns, amendments to legislation is really important. This is the task we have. This is why we have witnesses. Witnesses come and tell us when there's problems. There's never, ever been in all my years legislation that was perfect. It always has things that aren't seen. So your testimony matters a lot. Ms. Fuller, I know that they've asked that you would put your responses in writing. I have many, many questions for you, but I think I'll sort of just do an overall frame of them, that working with the situation with the provincial consultation process in Nova Scotia on this, if you feel it's working, if you feel that this will help avoid conflict with fishers and other users in Nova Scotia, and whether or not that this bill, the way it's being written, would allow the federal and provincial governments to protect marine areas when they're needed to be protected, because we saw the situation with Sable Island oil leases. There had to be a huge public outcry to stop that and protect that area. Whether or not this legislation from the province of Nova Scotia will represent the needs of the province, the protection of environment, and protection of the fragile marine ecosystem. So if you could respond to us on that, that would be very helpful in going ahead. Ms. Josenans, I wanted some similar questions to you. One is whether or not you're able to talk about Sable Island, because that was in the last oil lease, I think, that was off Nova Scotia, and it was a huge public outcry. Do you believe that this legislation puts in place the ability to protect fragile marine ecosystems while allowing wind project development?
Yes, in short, and we speaking for the coalition, we do believe that those two things can coexist, and that we have a lot of ocean real estate, and we can still pursue the goals of the 30 by 30 and the 25 by 25 while transitioning towards clean energy. It will involve an all-in approach. It will involve rigorous marine spatial planning. But yes, absolutely, these two things can coexist and must coexist, because really we have the same goal: conserving our ocean and transitioning away from fossil fuels are all for the betterment of future generations. So these two things must coexist.
I know you're here to represent the coalition and you're going to be super careful. I'm going to ask you as a resident. You're from Lunenburg, are you not? So 2 years ago, I got an invite to speak at the Lunenburg Writers Festival. I was all pumped, and then there was like this terrifying hurricane, and nobody could get in, and they said, don't worry, we'll do it next year. And then the next year, I had to cancel at the last minute because there was a terrifying hurricane. I'm from the land of rocks and trees. I mean, I like the pictures of the Atlantic, but it scares the hell out of me. When that water moves and decides it's angry, you've got serious issues. Are you seeing in real time changes in the ocean because of what's happened with the climate?
Unequivocally, yes. Yes, absolutely. And not just, John, not just the ocean. I mean, we have just dealt with a massive snowstorm that was also referred to by one of your honorable members. The winds here are stronger than I've ever seen them. And yes, I sit on the board of our local museum, and we've had to replace sections of the wharf much more often than we've ever had to do in the past. Yes, unequivocally.
Because I was in St. John's a couple of years ago when I was running for NDP leader. I came in second, by the way, if you want that in Trivia Pursuits, but that doesn't matter. They couldn't.
You lost.
That's coming in second. It is what it is. But I got a thick skin. Will you guys be quiet? I'm trying to do serious work here. But when I was in St. John's, I was talking to fishers who couldn't get their boats out into the North Atlantic because they said there was so much ice coming down because of the melting ice that it was affecting the fishery. We know last June the water temperature in the North Atlantic was 1.36 degrees Celsius above average. That was really staggering. And we now have a new study that the Gulf Stream is at the weakest in 1,600 years, and in an El Nino year, they worry about a tipping point. So what does that mean for the ability of our fishing industry if they're going up against those odds of a changing climate in the ocean?
Yeah, making sure that was directed to me or my
I'm
colleague.
wondering who the question is for. Yeah, sorry.
Johannes, because she was in Lunenburg, so I'll start with her, and then we'll go to you, Ms. Power, if we can.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'd also love to hear what Ms. Power has to say. But yes, I mean, I'm down on the docks all the time, speaking to members of the fishery, and the concerns are real, absolutely. And it's not even just the extreme weather, but the change in migration patterns. Yes, I mean, to answer your question, yes, it is a great concern of the fishery to see what's happening with respect to our climate.
And just finally, Ms. Power, you represent the people who are out there day in, day out. Are they seeing changes?
So I'll try to keep it brief, but I could talk about this for a really long time. The answer, of course, is
She
yes. We are seeing definitely more aggressive, frequent coastal storms, notably Hurricane Fiona, which not only destroyed wharfs, vessels, also swept harmful materials like insulation and oil tanks into the water, which will likely impact recruitment rates for some marine species well into the future. There's an immediate need for improved coastal infrastructure. We see changing temperatures. This is affecting the life cycles of certain species. It's being disrupted. We're seeing increased prevalence of albino and blue and orange lobsters, which indicates changes in their molting cycle. Many species are moving into deeper fathoms of water, instinctively seeking out colder temperatures. So the changes we're seeing now are rampant, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you to our witnesses today for your testimony. I will remind witnesses you can provide a brief if there's anything you missed or additional information to committee members. Thank you for joining us today, and your insights were greatly appreciated. Colleagues, we are at the end of a meeting, but before we finish today, I just want to raise an important item. We have, our analyst has been waiting for drafting instructions for quite some time for Canada's clean energy plans. Mr. Angus, go ahead. Go ahead. I finished, so I wanted to put it to committee members.
You know, I certainly trust our analysts. I always like to let them put the stuff, let us look at it, and then we can decide if there's problems. But I think they've got the expertise. They've heard it all. So I'm very keen to just let them come forward and bring a plan.
Monsieur Simard, go ahead.
Pardon, je sais pas. I don't know if we talked about this the last week, or last meeting, but I have nothing prepared. Maybe we could think about this and send you something in written, or send something in written to our analysts. Could we get a date? Just off the cuff there, if we have to provide feedback that's thoughtful, that might be complicated. So we'd have to think about things a bit. So if we had a deadline, that would be great.
How about colleagues, like February 16th? That gives like a week to provide drafting instructions. You can send it to the analyst. Gives enough time to consult with members from all parties. Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
Can I ask one quick question?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Pratzer.
I believe there was some talk, and Mr. Angus mentioned it to us earlier at the start of the meeting, but travel to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Just wondering if there's any update on that, or if there's any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I don't have any update on that. It was our committee did move it forward to liaison and to the House. So if any of you would like to ask your whips to maybe quickly give us a decision so we can prepare accordingly here at the committee. I know our analysts and clerks are eagerly waiting, as we all are. So that's a little nudge to all committee members to nudge your whips to quickly make a decision and let us know so we can plan our schedule and business. So on that, February 16th, folks, get your information in for drafting instructions so our analysts can continue on the great work she's doing. And once again, thank you for attending today, all the witnesses for providing testimony. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting today? It sounds like it. Thank you. It is. Meeting adjourned.